The autumn sky over eastern France hung heavy with the gray promise of rain. It was October 1944, and the war in Europe had reached a critical turning point. German panzer commanders, battle-hardened veterans of countless engagements across 2 continents, stood in their open turrets, scanning the horizon with practiced eyes. They had faced Soviet T-34s in the frozen hell of the Eastern Front. They had dueled with American Shermans across the hedgerows of Normandy. They knew the sound of every Allied aircraft, from the thundering flying fortresses overhead to the deadly thunderbolts that could tear a tank column to shreds. But what they saw approaching that gray morning made absolutely no sense. A tiny aircraft, no bigger than a child's toy from their perspective, puttered toward them at what seemed like walking speed. Its fabric-covered wings wobbled slightly in the autumn breeze. The high-pitched buzz of its engine sounded more like an angry hornet than a weapon of war. It looked utterly harmless, like something a wealthy farmer might use to check his fields on a Sunday afternoon. Some of the German soldiers actually laughed, pointing at the absurd little plane as it drew closer. Others didn't even bother to track it with their weapons. Cubs, as the Americans called them, were spotters. Annoying, yes, because they called in artillery, but threatening, never. Then, without warning, smoke trails erupted from beneath the little plane's wings. The first rocket struck the lead tank with a violence that defied the size of the aircraft that had launched it. Metal screamed. Flames erupted. The tank lurched to a halt, smoke pouring from its engine compartment. Before the stunned German crews could react, the Cub banked sharply, impossibly tight, and came around for another pass. More rockets streaked downward. Another vehicle burst into flames, and another. Suddenly, every gun in the German column opened fire at once. Machine guns chattered. Rifles cracked. The little plane seemed to dance through the storm of lead, its pilot somehow threading the needle between streams of tracer fire that lit up the darkening sky like deadly fireworks. The Germans couldn't understand it. How could a Cub, a simple observation plane made of fabric and wood, be armed with anti-tank weapons? How could such a fragile craft survive the hurricane of bullets they were sending its way? And who was the madman flying it? The pilot's name was Charles Carpenter, but to the men who fought alongside him and the Germans who learned to fear the sound of his approach, he would become known by another name, Bazooka Charlie. And this was his war. To understand how a mild-mannered history teacher from rural Illinois came to be diving a tiny, unarmed observation plane at German tanks, we need to go back to a different time, before the world tore itself apart for the second time in a generation. Charles Carpenter was born on August 29, 1912, in the heart of the American Midwest. His childhood was spent on a family farm in rural Illinois, one of 6 children in a household where hard work wasn't just expected, but required for survival. The land was unforgiving, the seasons harsh, and the Great Depression that swept across America in the 1930s was particularly cruel to farming families. The Carpenter farm, like so many others, was lost to the economic catastrophe. It was a wound that would stay with Charles throughout his life, a reminder of how quickly stability could crumble, how hard-won security could vanish overnight. But Charles was fortunate in one crucial way. His intelligence and determination earned him scholarships, first to the Roosevelt Military Academy in Aledo, Illinois, then to Center College in Danville, Kentucky. These weren't just educational opportunities. They were lifelines, pathways to a future that seemed increasingly uncertain for young men of his generation. At Center College, Charles discovered his true calling: history, not the dry recitation of dates and battles, but the living, breathing story of humanity, the decisions that shaped nations, the choices that altered the course of civilization, the ordinary people who rose to meet extraordinary challenges. After graduation, Charles returned to Illinois and took a position teaching history at a high school in Moline. By all accounts, he was an exceptional teacher, patient, thoughtful, the kind of educator who didn't just fill young minds with facts, but taught them to think critically, to understand cause and effect, to see the connections between past and present. His students remembered him decades later, not for what he taught them about dates and treaties, but for how he made history come alive, how he helped them understand that they were part of an ongoing story. Charles married Elda, a woman who would prove to be his anchor through the storms to come. They built a life together, quiet and stable, centered around teaching and community. Charles ran a boys' camp in the Ozarks during summers, teaching outdoor skills and character development. It was a good life, a meaningful life, the kind of life a man could be proud of. Then came December 7th, 1941. Pearl Harbor changed everything. Like millions of American men, Charles Carpenter felt the pull of duty. He was 30 years old, married, a respected professional with every reason to stay home. But the teacher who had spent years helping young people understand the great struggles of history now found himself facing the greatest struggle of his generation. How could he teach about courage, about standing up for what was right, if he wasn't willing to do so himself? In 1942, Charles Carpenter was commissioned as a second lieutenant in the United States Army. Initially assigned to the infantry, he quickly realized that his contribution might be greater in the air. He applied for the glider corps, attracted by the idea of flying soldiers into battle. But the training was lengthy, and Charles was impatient. The war was raging. Men were perishing. Every day he spent in training felt like a day wasted. That's when he discovered another option. Army aviation was desperate for pilots to fly light observation aircraft. The training was shorter. The need was immediate. Charles transferred to flight school and discovered something unexpected. He loved flying, the freedom of the air, the clarity of perspective that came with altitude, the ability to see the big picture, quite literally, that came with rising above the chaos of the ground. By 1944, Major Charles Carpenter found himself in France, assigned to the 4th Armored Division of General George Patton's 3rd Army. His aircraft was a Piper L-4 Grasshopper, the military designation for what civilians knew as the Piper Cub. And in that modest little plane, Charles Carpenter would write one of the most remarkable chapters in the history of aerial warfare. The Piper Cub is an unlikely war machine. To understand just how audacious Bazooka Charlie's exploits were, you need to understand exactly what he was flying. The Piper L-4 Grasshopper weighed 800 pounds empty. Its maximum takeoff weight was just 1,220 pounds, meaning that with a pilot, fuel, and any equipment aboard, you had maybe 400 pounds to work with. The airframe was constructed of welded steel tubing covered with fabric like a shirt. The wings were wood and fabric. A strong person could poke a hole through the skin of the aircraft with their finger. The engine produced 65 horsepower. To put that in perspective, a modern riding lawnmower has more power. The Cub's top speed was around 85 miles per hour, and it cruised at closer to 75. You could lean out a car window at highway speed and feel roughly the same wind. The aircraft had no armor, no self-sealing fuel tanks, no defensive weapons. It was designed to be slow, stable, and economical, perfect for training pilots or spotting artillery, terrible for combat. The cockpit was open to the elements. On cold autumn mornings in France, pilots wore every layer they owned and still shivered. Rain soaked through, wind battered. The visibility was excellent, which was the whole point of an observation plane, but that meant you were completely exposed to whatever the weather or the enemy decided to throw at you. And yet, in the hands of skilled pilots, the L-4 proved to be remarkably effective. Its slow speed, which seemed like such a liability, was actually an advantage for certain missions. The Cub could fly low and slow over terrain, allowing pilots to spot camouflage positions that faster aircraft would miss. It could take off and land in impossibly short distances using roads, fields, even clearings in forests that would be suicide for larger planes. Its small size made it hard to hit, and its maneuverability was exceptional. A Cub could turn inside anything the Germans had in the air, but it was still fundamentally an unarmed observation platform. Pilots flew over enemy territory with nothing but their wits and their skill to protect them. Their job was to see and report, not to fight. They were the eyes of the artillery, calling in coordinates for the big guns miles behind the lines. It was dangerous work. The Germans knew how valuable spotters were and would fire at them whenever possible, but the Cub pilots were supposed to stay high enough to be safe from small arms fire, observe, and get out. Charles Carpenter had other ideas. In the autumn of 1944, the war in Europe had reached a critical phase. The The Allies had successfully landed in Normandy, broken out of the hedgerow country, and were now racing across France toward Germany itself. Patton's Third Army was leading the charge, moving so fast that supply lines struggled to keep up. But the Germans weren't beaten yet, not by a long shot. Hitler had ordered a counteroffensive. Fresh panzer divisions, including the feared 5th Panzer Army, were being thrown into the battle. The fighting around the town of Ericourt in the Lorraine region became particularly intense. German tanks, including the formidable Panthers and even some of the massive Tiger Heavies, were attempting to break through American lines. The 4th Armored Division, to which Charles Carpenter was attached, found itself in a desperate struggle. Charles flew mission after mission, spotting enemy positions, calling in artillery strikes, trying to give his fellow soldiers every advantage he could, but it wasn't enough. He would watch from above as German tanks maneuvered into position, would radio coordinates to the artillery, and would have to wait precious minutes for the shells to arrive. Sometimes the tanks would move before the artillery could engage. Sometimes the shells would miss. And always, men were perishing on the ground below while Charles circled overhead, armed with nothing but a radio. It gnawed at him. The teacher who had become a soldier was watching the biggest classroom of his life, and he felt helpless. Somewhere in those autumn weeks of 1944, Charles Carpenter made a decision. If he was going to fly over German tanks, he was going to do more than just look at them. He wasn't the first to have the idea. A few other Elbird pilots, men like Lieutenant Harley Merrick and Lieutenant Roy Carson, had experimented with mounting bazookas on their aircraft. They had achieved some success, taking out trucks and light vehicles, but Charles Carpenter was about to take the concept to a whole new level. The M101 bazooka was an American-designed anti-tank weapon. It fired a rocket-propelled grenade capable of penetrating armor. The weapon was designed to be carried and fired by infantry on the ground, but Charles saw potential in adapting it for aerial use. Working with ground crews who thought he had lost his mind, Charles managed to mount 6 bazookas on his L4, 3 on each side, attached to the wing struts. Think about that for a moment. 6 anti-tank weapons, each weighing several pounds, mounted on an aircraft that had a maximum useful load of 400 pounds. The mechanics were skeptical. The math barely worked. The center of gravity was all wrong. The drag from having 6 tubes sticking out into the wind would cut his already modest speed even further, and if he actually fired these things, the recoil and the blast might tear the fragile plane apart. Charles didn't care about their objections. He had them install a firing panel in the cockpit, a simple arrangement of 6 toggle switches mounted on the upper left wing root, each one connected to an igniter in one of the bazooka tubes. It was crude. It was improvised. It was completely unauthorized, and Charles knew it might just work. On the side of his aircraft's nose, Charles had nose art painted. He called his plane Rosie the Rocketer, a tribute to the women working in aircraft factories back home. The Rosie the Riveters, who were building the tools of war. It was a gesture that spoke to Charles's character, even in the midst of war, even while preparing to take his tiny plane into combat against German tanks. He was thinking about the people back home, honoring their contribution. The first test flight with the loaded bazookas was terrifying. The Cub wallowed through the air, struggling with the additional weight and drag. The handling was mushy. The rate of climb was nearly non-existent. If an engine failed, and the Continental engine was not known for perfect reliability, Charles would have about 3 seconds to find a place to crash before the overloaded Cub simply fell out of the sky. But the plane flew, barely, and that was enough. Now came the hard part, actually using the thing in combat. The first time Charles Carpenter dove his bazooka-equipped Grasshopper at a German armored column, he must have been terrified. No amount of courage eliminates fear. Courage is about acting despite the fear, and Charles Carpenter had courage in abundance. Imagine the moment. You're sitting in an open cockpit, fabric walls around you, a 65 horsepower engine clattering away in front of you. Below, German tanks are moving across the autumn landscape, their long gun barrels sweeping back and forth as commanders scan for threats. You know that each of those tanks has machine guns. You know that nearby there are almost certainly German infantry with rifles. You know that one bullet in the wrong place, through the engine or the fuel tank, or even just through you, and this is over. The Cub isn't going to protect you from anything, and yet you push the stick forward and dive. The ground rushes up. The tanks grow larger in your vision. You can see the camouflage pattern now, the road wheels, the commanders in their turrets. 80 yards, 70, 60. The whole world has narrowed down to this moment, this calculation of distance and angle and timing. Your hand reaches for the firing panel on the wing route, 50 yards, 40. You can see individual soldiers now, some of them looking up at you with expressions of confusion or contempt. A cub? What's a cub going to do? You flip the first toggle switch. The bazooka erupts with a roar that you feel as much as hear. The cub shudders from the recoil. Smoke trails back from the wing. The rocket streaks downward, impossibly fast compared to the crawling pace of the plane that launched it. For a moment, nothing. Then the rocket impacts the top of the armored vehicle in a blossom of flame and smoke. Metal tears. The tank lurches. Smoke begins to pour from the engine deck. The world explodes into violence. Every German gun that can bear on you opens fire at once. Tracers, visible even in daylight, arc up toward you like deadly fireflies. You can hear bullets snapping past, some close enough that you wonder if they went through the fabric of your wings. You haul back on the stick, standing the little cub nearly on its tail, using every bit of its remarkable maneuverability to get out of the line of fire. The G-force pushes you down into your seat. The engine screams in protest. The wings, loaded beyond their design limits and now subjected to violent maneuvering, creak alarmingly, but you're still flying, and that tank below isn't moving anymore. Charles Carpenter's first confirmed engagement was with a German armored car. It was a smaller victory than a tank, perhaps, but it proved the concept. The bazookas worked. The cub could survive the recoil and the blast, and Charles could handle the targeting and the violent maneuvering required to get in, shoot, and get out before the Germans could track him effectively. Word spread quickly through the 4th Armored Division. There was a crazy major flying around in a cub with rockets strapped to it, hunting tanks. Some pilots thought he was reckless. Some thought he was brilliant. Most thought he was probably not going to survive very long. Charles kept flying. He upgraded some of his bazookas to the improved M9 model, which could fire the more powerful M6A3 high-explosive anti-tank rounds. These had better penetration, crucial when going after the thicker armor of German tanks. The mechanics, who had initially been skeptical of the whole enterprise, now threw themselves into the project. They developed better mounting systems. They worked on ways to reduce drag. They became invested in keeping their Mad Major alive and his unconventional weapon operational. The Germans, meanwhile, were starting to notice. At first, the appearance of an armed cub seemed like a joke, an American improvisation that would quickly be shut down. But as Charles racked up more victories, the attitude changed. Orders went out to panzer crews. If you see a cub, shoot it down. Don't wait. Don't hesitate. That little plane is dangerous. Charles noticed the change immediately. Where before he could sometimes overfly German positions without drawing fire, now every appearance brought a storm of lead. The Germans were taking him seriously, and that made every mission exponentially more dangerous. In a later interview with a newspaper, Charles would say, "Word must be getting around among those Germans to watch out for cubs with bazookas on them. Every time I show up now, they shoot with everything they have. They never used to bother cubs. Bazookas must be bothering them a bit." It was classic Carpenter, understating the situation with dry humor. But there was truth in it. The Germans were bothered. They had enough problems dealing with American Shermans on the ground and Thunderbolts from above. Now they had to worry about cubs, of all things, carrying anti-tank weapons. It was psychologically devastating. The idea that even the smallest, most insignificant-looking American aircraft might be armed and dangerous meant that German crews could never relax, could never feel safe, even from threats they had previously ignored. October 1944 brought the Battle of Aricourt, one of the largest tank battles on the Western Front. The fighting was intense, confused, and brutal. German armor was attempting to break through American lines. The 4th Armored Division, outnumbered and facing some of Germany's best remaining tank units, was fighting for survival. Charles Carpenter flew sortie after sortie. Sometimes he would be in the air 4 or 5 times in a single day. Each mission followed the same terrifying pattern. Take off from a field or road near the American lines. Fly low over the battlefield searching for targets. Spot a German tank or armored vehicle. Calculate the approach. Dive, fire, evade, survive, land, rearm, and do it all over again. On one particularly intense day, Charles destroyed 2 tanks in his first mission. He landed, the ground crew frantically reloaded the bazookas, and he was airborne again within minutes. On the second mission, he engaged another tank, maneuvering through ground fire so intense that soldiers watching from below couldn't believe he wasn't hit. After that mission, he landed and rearmed twice more, launching a total of 16 bazooka rockets in a single day's fighting. The official record would eventually credit Charles Carpenter with 6 confirmed tank eliminations. 6 German tanks destroyed by a man flying a fabric-covered plane that weighed less than some of the tank's individual components. But unofficial accounts from soldiers on the ground, from other pilots, from after-action reports, suggest the real number might be as high as 14, perhaps more. Record-keeping in the chaos of combat was imperfect. What mattered was that Charles Carpenter, teacher turned warrior, was making a real difference. His success earned him decorations: the Silver Star for gallantry in action, the Bronze Star with Oak Leaf Cluster, the Air Medal with Oak Leaf Cluster. But more importantly, it earned him the respect of the men he fought alongside. Tank crews knew that when they heard the distinctive buzz of Carpenter's Cub overhead, they had air support that wasn't afraid to get right down into the mud with them. Infantry soldiers watched this crazy major dive his unarmed plane at enemy armor and felt a surge of morale. If he had that kind of courage, how could they do any less? There's a photograph from this period that captures something essential about Charles Carpenter. He's standing beside Rosie the Rocketer, his modified L4 Grasshopper. The 6 bazooka tubes are clearly visible, mounted on the wing struts. Charles is smiling, but it's not the smile of someone who loves war or glories in violence. It's the smile of a man who has found a way to make a difference, who has taken a terrible situation and done something constructive with it. He looks tired. The strain of combat is visible in his eyes, but there's also satisfaction there. Purpose. The Germans, for their part, developed a healthy respect for Bazooka Charlie. Captured documents and post-war interviews revealed that word of the armed Cub had spread through German units. Some commanders refused to believe it at first. A Piper Cub with rockets? It sounded like American propaganda. But after enough encounters, after enough tanks were hit from above by this impossible aircraft, the reports could no longer be ignored. Orders were given. Training was updated. German soldiers were told to watch the skies not just for Thunderbolts and Mustangs, but for the little Cubs that might be carrying death beneath their wings. For Charles, this made every mission more dangerous. The element of surprise was gone. Now when he approached a German position, he was met with immediate and overwhelming fire. The fabric skin of his Cub was riddled with bullet holes after almost every mission. His mechanics would patch the holes, checking for any damage to vital systems, marveling that he was still alive. On several occasions, bullets passed close enough to Charles in the cockpit that he could feel the concussion. Once, a round went through his leather jacket without touching his skin. The margin between life and tragedy was measured in millimeters, but still he flew. As autumn turned toward winter in 1944, the nature of the war began to shift. The German counteroffensive was blunted. The Battle of Aricourt ended in an American victory, with hundreds of German tanks destroyed or disabled. Patton's Third Army continued its advance toward the German border. The war was far from over, but the momentum had clearly shifted toward the Allies. Charles Carpenter's contribution to the success cannot be overstated. While his 6 officially credited tank eliminations might seem modest compared to the hundreds of tanks destroyed by conventional forces, the psychological impact of his actions was enormous. Every German tank crew now had to worry about attacks from above, even from the smallest aircraft. Resources were diverted to anti-aircraft defense. Tanks that might have advanced more aggressively stayed cautious, wary of the sky. And American morale received a significant boost from the knowledge that even a school teacher in a tiny observation plane could take the fight directly to the enemy's most powerful weapons. But the war was taking its toll on Charles, flying multiple combat missions per day, living with the constant threat of being shot down, watching friends and fellow soldiers fall around him. All of it wore on him. He wrote letters home to Elda with increasing frequency, and while he never complained, never expressed regret about his choices, the strain is visible in his word. He was homesick, he was tired, He missed teaching. He missed normalcy. There's a particular poignancy in these letters. Here was a man who had spent his pre-war life teaching history, helping young people understand the great conflicts of the past. Now he was living history, participating in what would become one of the defining events of the 20th century. He knew, with a historian's perspective, that what he was experiencing would one day be in textbooks. Future teachers would stand in front of future classrooms and talk about the Second World War, about the liberation of Europe, about the defeat of tyranny, and Charles Carpenter, history teacher, would be a footnote in that story. A tiny footnote, perhaps. A curious anecdote about a man who armed a Piper Cub with bazookas and took on German tanks, but a real part of history nonetheless. As winter approached, Charles began to feel unwell. At first, he attributed it to exhaustion, to the accumulated strain of combat flying, but the symptoms persisted and worsened. Fatigue that didn't improve with rest, night sweats, a persistent feeling of being unwell that he couldn't quite shake. He kept flying, kept fighting, because that's what soldiers do. The war didn't care if you felt sick. The enemy didn't take holidays. You flew your missions and hoped for the best. By early 1945, as Germany's situation became increasingly desperate, Charles Carpenter was promoted to lieutenant colonel. It was recognition of his extraordinary service, his innovation, his courage under fire. But Charles's health continued to deteriorate. Finally, he was ordered to see medical personnel for a thorough examination. The diagnosis was devastating. Hodgkin's disease, a form of cancer that in 1945 was essentially a death sentence. The doctors gave him 2 years to live, maybe less. Charles Carpenter received an honorable discharge from the United States Army in 1946. The war in Europe had ended in May 1945. The war in the Pacific had ended in August. The world was at peace again, or at least not openly at war. Charles returned to Illinois, to Elda, to the life he had left behind 4 years earlier. But everything had changed. He had changed. The world had changed. And now he was facing a very different kind of battle, one that courage and innovation couldn't win. What do you do when doctors tell you that you have 2 years to live? When you're 33 years old, a war hero, a husband, a man who survived combat against one of history's most powerful military machines, only to be told that your own body is going to betray you? Charles Carpenter went back to teaching. He returned to his position at Urbana High School in Urbana, Illinois, teaching history to teenagers who couldn't possibly understand what he had been through, what he had done, what he had seen. And Charles didn't talk about it. He didn't wear his medals to school. He didn't regale his students with war stories. He simply taught history the way he always had, with passion and insight, helping young people understand the world and their place in it. In the summers, he continued to run his boys' camp in the Ozarks, teaching outdoor skills and character development, teaching young men to be better versions of themselves. It was the work he loved, the work he had always felt called to do. The war had been an interruption, a necessary interruption perhaps, but an interruption nonetheless. Now he was back to his real life's work. And miracle of miracles, he didn't pass away in 2 years, or 3, or 4. Charles Carpenter defied his diagnosis for 20 years. 20 years of teaching, 20 years of making a difference in young people's lives, 20 years of being a husband to Elda, a father to his daughter Carol, 20 years that the doctors said he wouldn't have. He finally passed away in 1966, at the age of 53, 21 years after being told he had 2 years to live. To the end, he remained the same man he had always been, quiet, thoughtful, more interested in helping others than in glorifying himself. His students from those post-war years remember him as an exceptional teacher, someone who made history come alive. Most of them had no idea about his extraordinary service during the war. He didn't talk about it unless asked, and even then, he was modest to a fault. Elda Carpenter, his wife, saved everything from Charles's war years, his letters, his photographs, his commendations. Not because she wanted to create a shrine, or because she saw potential for fame, but because she understood that what Charles had done was important, that the courage of ordinary people doing extraordinary extraordinary things should be remembered. She kept these materials carefully stored away, a private archive of an uncommon life. Decades passed. Charles Carpenter's story faded from public memory. The Second World War became history, the kind that Charles himself would have taught about. New conflicts arose, new heroes emerged. The old heroes, the men and women who fought in the greatest generation's war, aged and eventually began to pass away. And with them, their stories threatened to disappear. But then something remarkable happened. In 2017, a woman named Carol Apaki, Charles Carpenter's daughter, was reading online discussions among aviation history enthusiasts. The topic was the use of bazookas on light observation aircraft during World War II. And to Carol's shock, she discovered that these experts, these historians, were questioning whether the story of Bazooka Charlie was even real. With limited documentation available to them, they were suggesting it might be a myth, wartime propaganda, an exaggeration that had taken on a life of its own. Carol was, understandably, more than a little upset. Her father had been a real person. His service had been real. The risks he took, the missions he flew, the lives he saved, all of it was real. And she had the evidence to prove it. She opened the boxes her mother had so carefully preserved. Letters in Charles's own handwriting describing missions, photographs showing Rosie the Rocketer with its 6 bazooka tubes mounted on the wing struts, official commendations, after-action reports, a complete archive of Charles Carpenter's service, meticulously maintained for over 50 years. Carol systematically dismantled the doubters' arguments. She scanned documents. She shared photographs. She provided context and details that only someone with access to primary sources could offer. The online discussion transformed from skepticism to amazement to respect. Here was the real story, documented beyond any doubt, of a history teacher who became one of the most innovative and courageous pilots of World War II. A military historian and magazine editor named Jim Busha encouraged Carol to write an article about her father for Warbirds magazine, a publication of the Experimental Aircraft Association. Carol, who had no background in writing for publication, poured her heart into the piece. She told her father's story with love and pride, but also with accuracy and attention to detail. She let his letters and the historical records speak for themselves. The article was published, and the response was overwhelming. Aviation enthusiasts were amazed. Military historians took note. And most remarkably, the article led to the discovery of something everyone thought was lost to history. Rosie the Rocketer still existed. After the war ended in 1945, most American military equipment in Europe was either shipped home or sold as surplus. Charles Carpenter's L-4 Grasshopper, serial number 4330426, fell into the latter category. The Army had no particular reason to preserve it. It was just another worn-out observation plane among thousands. The bazooka mounts were removed, the distinctive nose art was painted over, and the plane was sold to an Austrian pilot. That pilot had no idea of the aircraft's history. To him, it was just a cheap surplus Cub, perfect for recreational flying in the beautiful Austrian countryside. He repainted it yellow, gave it civilian registration, and flew it for years. Eventually, the plane found its way to the Austrian Aviation Museum at Graz Airport, where it sat, largely forgotten, among other vintage aircraft. Museum curators knew it was an American L-4, but they had no idea whose L-4 it had been. Then came Carol Apaki's article, and with it, photographs showing the serial number on Charles Carpenter's aircraft. An aviation researcher named Joe Scheel, who had a habit of tracking down specific aircraft by their serial numbers, saw those photographs, and he remembered seeing that exact serial number somewhere before. It took time to confirm, to track down records, to verify beyond any doubt, but eventually the truth emerged. The L-4 Grasshopper sitting in storage at an Austrian museum was Rosie the Rocketer, the actual aircraft that Charles Carpenter had flown in combat, the plane that had terrified German tank crews, the 800-pound observation aircraft that had punched far above its weight in the skies over France. The Collings Foundation, a non-profit organization dedicated to preserving aviation history, acquired the aircraft. They arranged for its transport back to the United States, back to the country it had served so well, and then began the painstaking process of restoration. Restorer Colin Powers in Lapine, Oregon, took on the challenge challenge of bringing Rosie the Rocketer back to its World War II configuration. This wasn't just about making an old plane airworthy again, it was about historical accuracy. Every detail mattered. The olive drab paint had to be the right shade. The equipment in the cockpit had to match what Charles would have used, and crucially, the nose art needed to be restored. For this final touch, Carol Apacki's granddaughter, Erin Pata, stepped forward. Using photographs of the original artwork as reference, she carefully repainted Rosie the Rocketer on the nose of the aircraft, exactly as her great-grandfather had seen it painted over 70 years earlier. It was a moment of profound connection across generations. A young woman in the 21st century recreating the work that had adorned a warplane in the 1940s, bridging the decades with paint and love and remembrance. The restored Rosie the Rocketer now resides at the American Heritage Museum in Hudson, Massachusetts. It's not simply a static display. The aircraft is maintained in flying condition. Each fall during the museum's World War II reenactment, the distinctive buzz of a Continental engine echoes across the field as Rosie takes to the air once more. No bazookas now, of course. Those days are long past. But the sight of that small, unassuming aircraft aloft is a powerful reminder of what courage and innovation can accomplish. Carol Apacki, now in her 80s, has become something of an ambassador for her father's legacy. In 2017, she attended the Experimental Aircraft Association's annual air show in Oshkosh, Wisconsin, one of the largest aviation events in the world. Over 800,000 aviation enthusiasts attended over 7 days, and Carol, this elderly woman who had simply wanted to set the record straight about her father, found herself as a guest of honor. When she was introduced on stage as Charles Carpenter's daughter, the response was overwhelming. Hundreds of people gathered to hear her speak. Aviation enthusiasts who had spent years studying World War II aircraft history stood in line for hours to meet her, to thank her for preserving her father's story, to share how much his courage had inspired them. Jim Boucher, the editor who had encouraged her to write that first article, later said he had never seen anything like it. Carol was the star of the show, he recalled. You would have thought I was escorting an 18-year-old around. She was giddy. For Carol, it was vindication and celebration and grief all mixed together. Vindication that her father's story was real and recognized. Celebration that his courage was being honored. And grief, perhaps, that Charles himself never sought or received this recognition during his lifetime. He had been too modest, too focused on the work rather than the glory. Now, decades after his passing, the world was finally understanding the magnitude of what he had accomplished. A full biography, Bazooka Charlie, the unbelievable story of Major Charles Carpenter and Rosie the Rocketer, was published, giving readers the complete story of this remarkable man. It became popular among aviation history enthusiasts and military history buffs, introducing new generations to a hero they had never heard of. So what are we to make of Charles Carpenter's story? What lessons, if any, can we draw from the tale of a history teacher who became one of the most innovative combat pilots of World War II? First, there's the power of innovation. Charles Carpenter looked at a problem, German tanks threatening American soldiers, and refused to accept the limitations of his assigned role. He wasn't supposed to attack tanks. He was supposed to spot them for others to engage. But Charles saw a possibility that others had missed or dismissed. He had the courage to try something new, something that many considered impossible or insane, and through trial and error, through persistence and skill, he made it work. Innovation in wartime often comes from unexpected places. It's not always the generals or the engineers who come up with breakthrough ideas. Sometimes it's a major flying and observation plane who realizes that if you can mount a bazooka on an infantry soldier, you can mount one on a wing strut. The willingness to question assumptions, to try unconventional approaches, to risk failure in pursuit of success. These are the qualities that drive innovation. Second, there's the courage of ordinary people. Charles Carpenter was not a professional soldier. He was a teacher. He had every reason to stay in a safer role, to be content with his position as an artillery spotter. Instead, he chose to put himself in extraordinary danger, diving an unarmed aircraft at enemy tanks protected by machine guns and rifles. He did this not for glory or fame, but because he believed he could make a difference, could save lives on the ground. The Second World War is full of such stories. Ordinary people, teachers and farmers and shopkeepers who rose to meet extraordinary challenges. The greatest generation earned that title not because they were inherently better than other generations, but because when history called, they answered. Charles Carpenter answered that call in a very specific and remarkable way, but he was one among millions who made that choice. Third, there's the importance of preserving history. Without Elda Carpenter's foresight in saving her husband's letters and photographs, without Carol Apacki's determination to set the record straight, this story might have been lost, or worse, dismissed as myth. The doubters online would have remained convinced that Bazooka Charlie was propaganda or exaggeration. Future generations would never have known what Charles accomplished. We owe it to the heroes of the past, famous and obscure, to remember their stories accurately, not to lionize them or turn them into cartoons, but to understand them as real people who made real choices in real situations. Charles Carpenter was not a superhero. He was a man who was afraid, who got tired, who missed his wife and his home, but he was also a man who, when the moment demanded it, showed extraordinary courage and creativity. Both versions of Charles Carpenter are true, and both deserve to be remembered. Finally, there's the value of humility. Charles Carpenter never sought fame. After the war, he could have written books, given lectures, basked in the attention that his exploits might have brought him. Instead, he went back to teaching high school history. He ran a boys' camp in the summers. He lived a quiet life, focused on helping young people rather than glorifying himself. He was a hero who didn't need to be told he was a hero, who found satisfaction in the work itself rather than in recognition. In an age where social media has made self-promotion easy and common, where fame often seems to be pursued for its own sake, there's something deeply refreshing about Charles Carpenter's approach to life. He did extraordinary things because they needed to be done, not because they would make him famous. And then, having done them, he moved on to the next chapter of his life without looking back. Today, when aviation enthusiasts visit the American Heritage Museum in Hudson, Massachusetts, they can see Rosie the Rocketer. The small Piper L-4 Grasshopper, dwarfed by the larger aircraft around it, sits with its distinctive nose art clearly visible. 6 replica bazooka tubes are mounted on the wing struts, exactly as they were in 1944. Museum docents share the story of Charles Carpenter and his remarkable missions over the battlefields of France. And sometimes, on special occasions, they roll the plane out onto the field. The Continental engine coughs to life, the propeller begins to turn, and Rosie the Rocketer takes to the air once more, banking and turning with the same nimble grace that once allowed Charles Carpenter to evade storms of German gunfire. Watching it fly, it's hard not to be moved. This tiny aircraft, this 800-pound collection of fabric and wood and steel, changed history in its small but significant way. The German troops who encountered Bazooka Charlie in the autumn of 1944 couldn't believe what they were seeing. A Piper Cub with bazookas attacking tanks? It made no sense. It violated everything they understood about air combat, about the roles of different aircraft, about what was and wasn't possible. But Charles Carpenter made it possible. Through courage, through innovation, through sheer bloody-minded determination, a history teacher from Illinois transformed an unarmed observation plane into a tank-hunting weapon system that earned the respect of friend and foe alike. He saved lives. He boosted morale. He showed that even in the mechanized, industrial horror of modern warfare, individual initiative and courage still mattered. The story of Bazooka Charlie is unlikely to appear in major history textbook. It's a footnote, a curiosity, a remarkable anecdote in the vast story of World War II. Millions of people served. Millions of stories could be told. Charles Carpenter's is just one, but it's a story worth remembering. It reminds us that heroes come in unexpected forms, that courage isn't the absence of fear, but the willingness to act despite it. That innovation often comes from questioning the rules and trying something different. And that ordinary people, when circumstances demand it, can do extraordinary things. Charles Carpenter was a teacher. That's how he saw himself. That's what he returned to after the war. And that's what he did until his health finally failed 20 years after doctors said it would. He taught history before the war. He taught history after the war. And in between, for a few intense months in France, he made history. Flying a plane no bigger than a car, armed with weapons scavenged from the infantry, he took on the German panzer divisions and won. The German troops couldn't believe a Piper Cub was shooting bazookas at them, but it was. And at the controls was a man who understood that history is made not just by nations and generals, but by individuals who choose to stand up, to take risks, to make a difference, no matter how impossible the odds might seem. That's the lesson of Bazooka Charlie. Not that war is glorious, it isn't. Not that violence solves problems, it doesn't. But that ordinary people, armed with courage and creativity and an unwavering commitment to their fellow human beings, can achieve extraordinary things, can make a difference, can become, in their own way, heroes. Charles Carpenter flew home after the war. He went back to his classroom. He taught his students about history, about the great events and great people who shaped the world. And his students, most of them, never knew that the quiet man at the front of the classroom, the teacher who spoke with such insight about courage and sacrifice and duty, had lived those very qualities, had flown a tiny plane through storms of gunfire, had taken on tanks with rockets strapped to fabric wings, had written his own small but unforgettable chapter in the story of the Second World War. Rosie the Rocketer still flies. The buzz of that Continental engine is the same sound that German tank crews learned to fear in the autumn of 1944. The same sound that American soldiers learned to cheer, knowing that Bazooka Charlie was overhead, ready to dive into danger one more time. And somewhere perhaps Charles Carpenter would smile at knowing his story hasn't been forgotten, that the plane he flew, the missions he undertook, the courage he displayed still matter, still inspire, still teach, just as he always hoped to teach, about the best of what human beings can be when the moment demands greatness. The German troops couldn't believe a Piper Cub was shooting bazookas at them, but Major Charles Carpenter, history teacher, husband, father, and one of the most remarkable pilots of World War II, believed, and belief backed by courage made all the difference.